Welcome to the Conference Board webcast on resilience, increasing your team's capacity to perform. My name is Jeff Jackson. I'm Executive Director of Leadership and Experiential Programs at the Conference Board. I'd like to welcome you. The webcast today is brought to you by the Conference Board Leadership Development Experience Team. I just want to let everyone know on the webcast, we want to really create a discussion. If you have questions, please enter them, type them in the lower left-hand corner of your screen. And today's webcast will focus and shed some light on why resilience is so critical in the workplace and some of the key skills and traits needed for teams and people to be more agile. We'll explore different perspectives on organizational resilience and discuss some of the unique approaches to building this capacity. I want to introduce our speakers today. We have Joseph McCann, who's a distinguished principal research fellow with the Conference Board. He studied the sources and effects of dynamic change on individuals and organizations for over 25 years in his scholarship and consulting work. He's completed his MA and PhD at the Wharton School. We also have William Tincup, one of the country's leading thinkers on social media application for human resources and an expert on adoption of HR technology. William has been blogging about HR-related issues since 2007. He's also a contributor to Fistful of Talent, HR Tech Europe, and the HR Examiner, and co-hosts a daily HR podcast called Drive Through HR. And we have David Hutchens, who's an author, business writer, and learning designer who creates communication solutions for many Fortune 500 companies. David's work has been recognized with distinction, including ASTD's prestigious Excellence in Practice Award. And he's partnering with the Conference Board in designing and developing our Team USA leadership experience at the U.S. Olympic Training Center in Colorado Springs. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining us. So to set up the topic a little bit, building resilience has really been a major subject and issue identified by our member companies. And many of the companies that we work with in our experiential leadership programs included the need to build resilience for their executives and their teams as a primary goal in their leadership development. The conversation also seems to be shifting from individual to team resilience and the organizational impact of resilience on performance. Part of this was the reason why we focused the Conference Board development of the Team USA leadership development experience in the United States and the gold medal leadership development experience in Europe on resilience as a key topic. So resilience is a concern due to the obviously increasing shocks and disruptive changes. Many people know them as the new normal. But there's also a flip side of resilience, and that's the resilience as a result of success. How do organizations which really never have the time to fully recover from success, and they just tend to move on to the next big thing, how do these successful organizations allow their teams to recover and help them get to that high level of performance to get to that next goal? So it's really a relentless pace, nonstop change. It wears on the organization, it wears on the team, and it wears on the individual and their response capabilities down to an almost dangerous level. There's an impact on individual health and well-being, and certainly there's a lot of growing research and writing around wellness. It's very relevant, especially today, due to the intensity of the debate around the Affordable Care Act and the cost of health care for companies. There's also an employee engagement and performance issue that's related to this, and workplace violence is also an issue. So it's been a hot topic for a while, but we see it's taking on a whole new sense of urgency. Joe McCann with John Selsky made a case for some new capabilities to manage turbulence in their book, Mastering Turbulence, the Essential Capabilities of Agile and Resilient Individuals, Teams, and Organizations. So Joe, welcome today. Thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you. And I'm extremely pleased to be here because I was invited into the early Think Design stage, beta testing of the Team USA program, and I immediately saw the relevance of that program to some of John and my interest in agility and resilience. So was a great fit, so I'm very pleased to be here.
And I think I know a lot of your research really helped to shape what our focus is on resilience at the program. Could you define what you mean by resilience?
Yeah, it's one of these words that is used very freely, and I've always been curious how we can think of a word like resilience to describe an individual, but we also talk about resilient organizations, and so we leap levels here, and I think it's a darn good question to ask how well that works. But one thing that John and I discovered through our research, and a lot of it was empirical, I mean, it was with several hundred companies over a long period of time, is that indeed the concept of resilience does work across levels, individual, team, organization, and even larger to the level of a system. And all you have to do is look at our financial system to say how resilient is that, and the answer is pretty darn resilient. We took a major hit there, but we seem to be recovering from it. So the concept works across levels, but I think just to create some clarity here, I think the concept of resilience has three elements. It's the capacity or ability of an individual, team, organization, even system to absorb the impact of an event or surprise, including sustained ones. And one of the things that John and I was discovering was that these shocks and surprises are coming more tightly packed. You don't have the opportunity to fully recover. There is no breather in between these things. So it's like one successive event or shock or something occurring, one right after the other. And so this notion of recovery time isn't there. But so it's the ability of a team, let's stay with teams, to take a hit, to absorb the impact of something. The second element is the ability of a team to react effectively and appropriately. There's a lot of ways of inappropriately responding. Run away. But I guess sometimes running away is the right thing to do.
Fight or flight is a basic human response.
But nonetheless, I think there are appropriate or more effective ways of reacting to the impact of something. And then the ability to respond. And in the most extreme cases, and very few organizations are asked to do this, but some are. I think you could look at the example of the electric utility in Tokyo, Japan, as a result of the tsunami and the loss of their reactors and this sort of thing, where organizations are actually being asked to reinvent themselves in response to the impact of something. So when we talk about resilience, it's the ability to take the hit, to react and respond appropriately, and the capacity to reinvent if necessary. So that's how we tend to think of the word.
So how does agility link with resilience?
Well, I know the focus is on resilience for our conversation today. But one of the things that I want to stress is that you really can't think about resiliency without the other side of the coin, which is agility. I think an agile organization that's able to avoid a collision, to get out of the way and avoid an impact of something, that's just as interesting as resiliency. So the idea of being able to be aware, to anticipate, and to have well-adaptive, very quick responses to avoid a collision, I think may be just as important as being able to take the hit and respond after.
Sure. So the preparedness obviously plays a big role in that. So let me ask William. William, you have an interesting perspective in that you work with a lot of HR practitioners dealing with some of their day-to-day challenges. What are some of the HR people that you're talking to? Why are they so concerned with building resilience both for teams and individuals?
Yeah, I think, first of all, great question, Jeff. I think you start off with, first of all, it probably doesn't mean the exact same to every single HR pro. But what is the same almost in every company is that the machine has to keep running. You know what I mean? That's what HR in some ways is responsible to make sure that the machine, no matter what happens, the machine has to keep running. Business continuity has to keep going. And so I think that on some level you can care about resiliency or not care about resiliency, but change is going to happen. The only constant, I think the cliche is the only constant is change. And change is going to happen. And so how does one help build or help instill an adaptive culture? Like, hey, things are going to happen, and we need to be able to weather any storm that gets thrown our way. And I think that's all under the guise or under the umbrella of business continuity, which is extremely important to HR, is that the machine has to keep going. Okay, so-and-so left. Okay, how are we going to deal with it? So how can we consume change, at a rapid pace, be able to swallow whatever change is, adapt to it, and be resilient enough that the machine runs. And so I think that's where you can pull in, your HR manager at a 50-person shop and your CHRO at a, 300,000, person shop. They have that in common. Mm-hmm. The machine has to keep running.
Now, how do you think the conversation has changed over the last decade? Obviously, we've gone through a very turbulent time economically. Do you think that that the conversation around resilience has changed since the new normal? And are we talking about the same topic, or is it more enhanced? Is it more severe? Is technology impacting this at all?
Yeah, again, great question. I think that, first of all, your mobile, social, transparency of the Internet, all of those types of things. But I think on some level, I think we care more about culture now than we did 10 years ago. 10 years ago, it was, in some ways, I think it was almost thought of as a nice to have, not a need to have. Whereas now, when you talk to HR people, it's in the first 3 to 5 things that they talk about. Mm-hmm. So it's high on their list, like how do we build culture? How do we instill culture? How do we have a values-based discussion around, X, Y, and Z? So I think culture has become probably top of the list, and as it's become top of the list, and I think all the drivers that you just mentioned, the era of transparency, I mean, at any given point, anybody, an employee, a candidate that's looking to get a job, anybody can go to Glassdoor, for example, and see what's going on, quote unquote, what's going on inside of a firm. And that wasn't there 10 years ago. Just that level of kind of insight and visibility and transparency wasn't there. And so we operated and behaved differently. And so now, I think that business continuity strain has always been there. But I think the pressure and HR's getting closer and closer and closer to the business goals, and not, when HR first started, HR was the personnel department, probably the furthest from the business objectives. Now, pretty directly linked to the business objectives, and I think as it's done so, more and more of that's become a game of business continuity for HR.
Well, that's very helpful. David, as a designer of experiential learning programs, we both know that culture is such an important element of what we're trying to talk about and discuss, and many of the companies that we partner with are trying to build or improve upon for their participants. How do you work that culture issue to develop people to become more resilient?
So, as Dr. McCann and you both mentioned at the beginning of this program, we have created a new program that is the Team USA Leadership Experience. And so the Conference Board has developed this immersive leadership experience in partnership with the U.S. Olympic Committee. And so we meet at the Olympic Training Center out in Colorado Springs, Colorado. It's a beautiful place. And we meet with athletes and coaches and sports psychologists. and leaders and administrators at the USOC. And we have these conversations from an organization whose output is performance and resiliency. I mean, this is what they do, and they're very purposeful about it. And so I think that one of the first lessons that we draw from the elite athletes and elite coaches at the U.S. Olympics is that resiliency is a purposeful pursuit. And it's not something that is left up to chance, and then one day something happens and you discover whether you have resiliency or not. Mm-hmm. It's high on the agenda. You know, this is something that they're talking about and training for. And, you know, as we've pointed out, there's an awareness that resiliency occurs it's systemic. It occurs at different levels. And so there's, you know, certainly the biological, physiological level, you know, the resiliency of the human body. And certainly there's urgency around this if you're an elite athlete in training. I mean, how much punishment can my body take? And so there's a lot of conversations about, you know, the performance cycle and the idea that I can stress the system, this biological system, and then that there are moments of rest and recovery. You know, I have an intense workout, and then I have to stay in bed a little bit longer so that my muscles can rebuild and recover. That alone is a fascinating conversation for organizations, because we ask our member organizations all the time, you know, how are you doing with the performance cycle? You know, after your people have the big win or the big loss, after that moment of execution, tell us what recovery looks like. And usually people start laughing when we say that, because nobody is recovering. There is no recovery in organization. It's off to the next thing. So there's resiliency at the physical level. Then there's at the individual level, the person who executes the work. And so we have many case studies of athletes who come to this moment of execution, you know, in the Olympics, in the glare of spotlight, with millions of people watching, and this is the moment that they've trained for perhaps all their life. So high stakes, high pressure, and the stories are either triumphant or they're heartbreaking. And so the stories of resilience in that moment of execution, of delivering the work, are very informative. And again, part of the work that we do is drawing from those stories and saying, what can we bring to the individual contributor in the organization? And then the next level up is the team level, or the organizational level. And again, there are many case studies that we can draw from. If you look at the women's water polo team in London in just this past year, there's a fascinating case study where they were 1 second away from winning the gold medal match, and the coach, Adam Krikorian, makes a mistake, makes a bad call on the sidelines that throws them into an unnecessary 15-minute overtime. And so 1 second away from achieving the dream of their lifetime, and now a mistake has screwed the whole thing up. As a team, we watch the women's water polo team exercise this resiliency in the moment. You can see it in their faces. You see it on the video when they're in the water. And so that leads to some fascinating conversations of, what does that collective capability look like? What are the behaviors? What are the capabilities and the characteristics that need to be in place that we can be purposeful about now in building, so that the team has that capability for resilience at the moment that it needs it most? And the program has some pretty fascinating ideas about that.
So that's helpful. You know, Joe, let me ask you something. David was talking about this multi-level perspective, you know, developing the capability of resilience in individuals, and then in teams, and then in organizations. Could you give me a little bit of your perspective on that? What are some of the things that really impact that kind of development?
You know, I'd like to find enough evidence to suggest it's not true, but for a long time I've been saying that a team is only as resilient as its weakest member. And teams break, And I've had the opportunity over a professional career watching a lot of leadership teams, for example, in organizations, and one in particular right during a merger process, the CFO went down with a heart attack and this sort of stuff, and it almost derailed it. So here was a leadership team, which, by the way, wasn't taking good care of itself in terms of exercise, nutrition, managing stress, that sort of thing, in a prolonged merger acquisition process. But here was one individual within that almost derailed or certainly delayed the process because of something with them. Now, the good news is recovered and everything went through and everybody celebrated a successful deal. But the point is that if you don't work at the individual level around both agility and resilience, but particularly resilience, then how can you expect to have strong teams? And this is really true in top leadership teams during prolonged periods of stress and duress, from something like a 3-year, 4-year, 5-year long merger acquisition campaign, for example, where this is the standard process. The a team doesn't exist context-free. And so a team within an organization, if the surrounding resources aren't available to support the team, if the team isn't integrated into the decision-making processes of the organization, if the team doesn't have top leadership support, then its resilience will be compromised. So, one of the characteristics of resiliency is the ability to draw upon resources as needed from, if you don't have the resources yourself, then from those around you. So if a team's really struggling, then it needs to be supported by the organization. And if the organization can't provide that support, in other words, its own resiliency is compromised, then it's going to compromise the team. So these levels are very closely related to each other. I know it really complicates our ability to have programs that focus just upon team. All I'm saying, to build team resilience, all I'm saying is you need to be aware of and sensitive to those connections between the individual and the next level up, the organization levels, when you're focusing on that team's, building that team's resilience.
Well, you talk about an interconnectedness that people have in the teams and how important that is to maintain this sense of resilience. William, I want to ask you, because there was an interesting article recently in the New York Times, about how technology, smartphones, and the need for that constant interconnectedness, how it really dramatically increases the number of work hours, and the impact. How do you see HR people working within their organizations to balance productivity and manage stress? There seems to be that flip side where, we see productivity getting much higher in this country and around the world, but that stress level is going with it. How do you see people managing to that?
And Jeff, what's funny is, and people listening to the call can probably relate to this, but there was a time. Bear with me. There was a time when you left your office on Friday and you didn't have access to email, not even webmail. You didn't have access to anything work-related. And those that can remember that time, it wasn't that long ago, but those that can remember that time, there was a lot of stress on Sunday night. There was a whole lot of stress of what am I going to be walking into. Mondays back then were, I'm going to have to uncover myself from all of this stuff. So I think the thing is stress, it's relative. And I think at the end of the day, work on some level is about stress management. And I think that the key in that article and in our discussion is have to versus want to. Most people want to have visibility and insight 24/7. Like if they get up in the middle of the night and they want to check their phone to see if anything has happened, fine. I'm not in the business of telling people what they should or shouldn't do. If that's what you want to do, then I feel like we're living in a blessed time when you can do that if you want to. I think the article was clear around have to. When our expectations have changed in such a way that bosses in particular, crazy whacked out bosses more specifically, but bosses have an expectation that you are there over the weekend, at night, in the morning, 24/7, right? And so when it's have to, that's when we get into a tricky area, and it's dangerously close to burnout. And I think that I read the same article, and I came away from it remembering the adage of people don't quit companies. They quit bad bosses. That's what really happens. Day to day, I don't care if it's a 50-man shop, or Walmart, largest employer in America, whatever. Truth is, when you quit a manager, you quit a boss. And I think it's those bosses that have those whacked out expectations, that's what drives good employees away from them. And I think that the why HR cares about all of this, it's really simple. One of the main goals of HR is to retain top talent. I hate making HR simple, because what I've found over the last 4 years is that HR is not simple. It's actually very complex. But one of the goals is to retain top talent. And a single biggest barrier to retaining top talent is bad managers. So the article is it's kind of illustrating a problem with bad managers insofar as their expectations. And I keep saying they're whacked out in expectations, but the point is they have the expectation on Saturday night at 10 o'clock, they send you an email that you respond. That gets into the have-to bucket, which I think, unless you're an agent in Hollywood, I think that most people can do that for a short period of time, but at a certain point, they don't want to do that. And they want to have a better quality of life, better work-life balance, etc.
Well, I think, managers certainly absorb the culture of their organizations and also help to create new cultures within their team that could be in response to their organizations or unique to their own personalities. We have one question from the audience that I want to address to David around culture. So how can culture remain constant, David, during these times of dramatic change? Is there a way to sort of provide that consistency of message or consistency of culture even when the organization's going through dramatic change?
Yes. The way you preserve culture is by being intentional and by telling the stories that are informative of who we are in this culture. And it's using the language of resilience and calling out what are the capabilities that we have built, what are the capabilities that are present in the culture that allow us to respond with resilience to the scenario that we are in. What are the characteristics that we have? And again, Dr. McCann's research is very informative here. It's very helpful because he identifies what these characteristics are. One of the cultural characteristics that comes up a lot in the Team USA program is the idea of awareness. And what is the organization's and the team's capacity for directing its awareness during those moments of pressure or stress or setback where resilience becomes important? And at the Olympic Training Center, their work is very much informed by a psychologist from the 1970s, a guy named Robert Nidefer, who proposed a model that is the theory of attentional style. And what he says is that in organizational cultures, we have an attentional style. Teams direct their attention to certain things, and it's going to be different from culture to culture. And it's helpful that he presents this attentional style on a couple of continuums. he says that the first continuum where a team or an organization can direct its attention is internal versus external. And so, for example, in the world of the Olympics, an internal attentional style would be helpful if I'm a diver. I'm perched at the edge of a platform, and I'm about to release myself into the water far below. And so I'm choosing to focus on things like my breathing, my posture, my level of arousal and heart rate and anxiety or calm or the alpha waves in my brain. So it's a very internal orientation. I'm probably not focusing on the crowd or what the announcer is saying at the side of the pool. I've drowned all that out. Internal focus. Versus if I'm a goalie in a game of hockey, let's say the Tampa Bay Lightning is hurtling towards me with their teeth baring. At that moment, I'm not thinking, my heart rate is increasing right now. No, I have a very external focus. I'm focusing my attention on what's happening around me so that I can be prepared to respond. So depending on the context, I'm having to make decisions about where do I put that focus, internal or external. And then the other continuum that Nidifer talks about is a broad awareness versus a narrow awareness. So let's say I'm on a synchronized swimming team. Throughout a performance, I'm constantly shifting back and forth purposefully between the broad awareness and the narrow awareness. Broad awareness. Where are we in the routine? How is the team doing? What is the feedback from the audience in the room? I mean, that is informative feedback. That's helpful feedback. So broad awareness, then narrow awareness. Am I in sync? What do I need to do differently? So constantly shifting back and forth between broad and narrow, then internal and external. And so the capability is making these decisions purposefully. So let's say that you're an organizational team and you've just experienced a setback. So everybody is reeling now. And as a leader, you have some decisions to make. Where are we going to focus attention and in what sequence? So do I go external and begin thinking about the marketplace impact of the setback we've just experienced? Do I go internal? Do I need to focus on my own anxiety first and address my own emotions so that I can be effective? Do I go broad and begin brainstorming all the things that went wrong and all the different systemic interventions that are required in order to make sure this never happens again? Do I go narrow? What are the immediate steps in front of us, the short-term interventions, the reaction that's required of me right now? Now, as an organizational leader, I'm probably going to do all those things. But resilience, the cultural capacity for resilience and awareness, is having wisdom in the sequence in which I do those things, and the sequence in which I lead my team and my organization through these different sets of awarenesses so that we can manage the setback or manage the event, and then move forward with resilience and then with agility.
David, that's helpful. Let me ask you, Joe. David's talking about how different sports require different capabilities to respond. What about in the workforce? Let's talk about the application in the workforce. Different roles, different levels. Are the capabilities dramatically different between someone who is more junior in the organization and their ability to respond versus someone who's more senior? Are there different capabilities required at different levels?
They may look different. They may manifest themselves a little differently, but some of the same qualities are there. For example, this notion of purposefulness and awareness. Those are essential capabilities regardless. Okay, so those span. They may take different forms or different shape depending on where you're in the organization, your role, or the level at which you're working, individual, team, or organization. But those capabilities are the same. I wanted to address a couple points. I heard the word culture, and I also heard the word purposeful. No question. I think one of the foundational capabilities around team resilience in general, is this notion of purposefulness. And it's the foundational capability for John and I in terms of our writing and our work. Now, by that I mean a sense of clear purpose, meaning a positive self-identity, who I am, who we are we as an organization. We have a positive role to play in the society. We deserve to last. We deserve, to be here because we have something to offer, something to contribute. I mean, that's fundamental, and that's the sort of thing that'll get you through. And that's built around clear and shared values and beliefs at a team level, around that sense of identity and that purpose. So that's where the culture piece comes in, and culture is really important. There's some aspects of culture that you want to change over time and need to change, but at the core has to be this clear sense of identity and values and beliefs that are the bedrock. They're the sorts of things that get Sandler O'Neill through 9/11 or some of these other organizations, AIG even. Take your pick, a financial crisis. Important dimension of this, though, is this. Let's go back to this idea of wellness. I mean, it's fundamental there that if you don't have, it's impossible to sustain over a long period of time, under extreme conditions of anxiety, stress, and just the pressure of events and what have you, a sense of purpose, that identity and values and beliefs. These are eroded by turbulence, and they'll wear you down eventually. Now, the only thing that can help you is this strong sense of well-being, and that's psychological, it's physical, and that's what Team USA, it's real easy to focus on that and say, great athletes. No, I think we those of us who saw some of the Team USA activities saw very clearly it's as much a head game as it is anything else. I mean, psychological well-being is absolutely critical here. And then, of course, social well-being, which I define in terms of having strong, positive relationships with family or loved ones, co-workers, out in the community, for example. All these have been found to be contributors to a positive self-identity and strong values and beliefs that allow you to sustain yourself. So well-being is very closely tied into this, and that's why I did some of my research over the past year at the conference board around what's happening around wellness programs in the country. I mean, there's a definite connection here between the level of interest in preventive health care. It's not just about lowering health care costs, but we know that that individuals within organizations that participate in wellness programs have a higher level of engagement and higher level of performance in terms of just their psychological and physical well-being. So these things are related, but when I heard the words culture and purpose, I just had to respond to that.
No, and that's really helpful. In the conversations that I have with a lot of senior HR executives, obviously we talk about the idea of culture, we talk about wellness and sort of that whole body approach to work and life, that balance. The idea of sense of purpose, sense of clarity, those are really important. Certainly clear and shared values. William, I want to ask you a question because I know you deal with HR executives dealing with multi-generational workforces. So you have millennials, you have people who are coming in to the workforce new, and obviously there's a big number of people retiring from the workforce. How does this sort of play a role? The idea that you have different generations of people who may look at these things very differently. How does someone in HR really manage that? Because it seems that you're taking it from so many different perspectives based upon the generation of the group that you're dealing with.
I think the thing is what HR would say is this is a teachable moment. and in truth, resilience, just as a concept, might mean something different to all four of us and to everybody that's listening to the call. So I think inside of an organization, you have to find examples of resilience and highlight those examples, and then use that as a way to teach and to create kind of a shared ideal or a shared experience, if you will, around what is and what isn't resilient. And I think that inside of an organization, you have a lot of wonderful moments, teachable moments, where you can say, you know what, Bob, I like how you did that. Your manager was in the hospital for a month. You kind of took over. You didn't really wait for anybody to kind of tell you what to do. You just kind of picked up the pieces and you ran with it. And the department ran better without Bob than it did with Bob. And you know what? I appreciate that. B, let's all celebrate that. So I think there's an element of teaching that goes on with something like resilience in that yes, we do have 4 different generations at work, but in some ways we're always going to have different generations at work. And so there's always that wheel is always turning. And so I think from an HR perspective, it's more of a game of, okay, it's not necessarily trying to show and highlight the boomer ideal of what resilience is or the millennial ideal of what resilience is. It's what does resilience mean to this organization? And let's highlight examples of what that looks like so that we can all kind of say, yes, that is resilience for us.
You know, that's a really great point, William. And I'm going to turn to David because this really rolls into what you and I have spoken about extensively, which is the idea of storytelling. How do you, within an organization, create these internal stories about resilience that can cut across all generations, cut across all functions, but builds the culture, builds an understanding of what is important and what should be intentional to the organization and to the team and to the individual. So how does an organization go about creating these stories?
I love what William just said, and I actually have a story about that. Because what the Team USA program does really beautifully is it provides those stories. It provides maybe even some really painful stories that somebody else experienced. So you don't have to experience it. We experience the pain, so you don't have to. So just a few months ago, you were with us, Jeff. We were at the Olympic Training Center, and we showed the video that I referred to earlier of the women's water polo team in London, 2012. And it's an agonizing video because, again, they're 1 second away from the gold medal, and the coach makes a bad call that screws everything up. And now they're thrown into overtime, and now this certain thing is thrown into question. The most important moment of our lives, and now the coach has jacked it up. It's panic. You feel panic as you watch it. So we had in the room a Fortune 100 technology firm, the top leaders, and we watched this video. And the senior sports psychologist was in the room with us, so he kind of narrated the video and explained what was happening. And we got to the end of the video, and then the leader of that organization that was in the room with us looked at his people and said, that capacity of resilience that we just saw on the video is something that we don't have. And it was this sacred kind of moment of truth-telling where people were just quiet because the story revealed a deficit that they had. And so they said, let's go back to the story. And so we went through the story. We went through the video and we freeze-framed it. Look at the response of the women in the water. Look at their faces. Look at the choices that they made. What are they doing that's helping them move forward with leadership? And I'll go ahead and tell you the end of the story. Even being thrown into the unnecessary overtime, they won the game and went on to win the gold medal. I mean, it's a beautiful story of bouncing back after something goes terribly wrong. But that story became the case study that represented the capacity that was missing in this organization, and also presented some possibilities for behaviors and things that this organization could do differently. And it was a deeply impactful moment. And again, that's the power of story. It brings us into realities that we may not have had to experience. And because the power of story and the way mirroring works, when we hear a story, it's like we're experiencing it. It puts us in the scenario. So that becomes a form of skill building, awareness and skill building, so that now this team and this organization has a prescriptive idea of what they need to do differently so that they have that capacity. Next time they're in the gold medal match and things get screwed up with 1 second left, they now have some very specific ideas of what they need to do as a team, and it's ideas that they didn't have before.
Well, David, that's really helpful, and I actually want to encourage people who are watching the webcast to type in questions. We have a number of questions, and one of them I actually want to go back to you, David, with. It's around, once you create the right organizational stories, how do you teach people to be able to tell them effectively? I mean, is it around skill development on presentation? What's the sort of the link to that capability of being able to tell those stories effectively within your organization?
So now you're on one of my very favorite topics, which is storytelling as a leadership capability. And I'll just start simply by saying, tell the story. A lot of leaders need permission, need the reminder that the stories that you are experiencing in your organization, the big screw up is a knowledge asset in your organization. And one of your responsibilities as a leader is to share that story, because this is the groundwork for capability building, for learning, for creating knowledge that others can draw from in the organization. So, the stories get lost. People don't tell the stories, especially if the story is about a screw-up. In many organizations, the culture makes it difficult to tell those stories. I want to tell the stories about the great work that I did. I don't want to tell the stories about the time that I dropped the ball. And yet, the cultural acceptance of those resilient stories is very critical, as well as the awareness that when my team experiences the big mess up, we're going to tell other people about this, and we're going to tell people what we learned from it.
So, Joe, could you comment on that a little bit? In terms of your experience, where have you seen either success or failure in organizations able to capture stories specifically on resilience and communicate them to the organization? Is it about trying to build that skill? Is it about having people sort of discover that themselves? Mm-hmm. Or what do you think the touch point is?
I was privileged to have a dean of a business school when I was at Emory University, John Robson, who has since passed on. But John Robson was one of these great storytellers, and he used word pictures. It's one thing to say, boy, we're under a lot of pressure here, we need to do something. He could have just said those words. No, he didn't. He said, boy, we're just being ground down by a huge rock or somebody's boot on it. It was an image. It was vivid. It was real. It was something that you could visualize. And so he may use 3 words, but 1,000 were conjured up in your head. That was a real skill that John had. But I think the important thing, it doesn't matter. One of the key characteristics around resilience is this learning orientation. This is about adaptation to change. Go back to William's point. It's about change, and so you have to have this orientation towards learning from something. And stories are a way of learning, of course. Now, this idea of organizational learning is really powerful, and that's saying that we made a mistake, Okay, would we learn from that? Here's a story of a mistake. How did the women's water polo team respond to that? What are the lessons? So you have to have this constant interest and curiosity about and this willingness to debrief and work through the experience and say, what are the lessons we can extract, and how do we share those to improve our ability to respond better, faster, more effectively the next time if something happens that we encounter. So this learning orientation is really critical here. And so when I hear the stuff about storytelling, it's always reminding me that it's about organization learning and making sure you have a learning orientation of individuals and the teams, because that means that you can take those stories and become and build your resiliency.
Mm-hmm. You talk about learning orientation. I think, William, you're my go-to guy when it comes to technology in the HR space. And, if you want to create this learning orientation in your organization, it's a large organization. You want to take the best practices of successful teams and communicate them throughout the organization. What's some technology that you've seen work? And a sort of follow-up question to that is, does the technology get in the way sometimes?
Yeah, well, I think the way I would answer that, Jeff, is there's some wonderful advances in social learning. So there's been wonderful kind of LMSs, learning management systems that have been around for a long time. Cornerstone on Demand, publicly traded company, started as an LMS. Saba, publicly traded company, started as an LMS. There's some wonderful LMSs out there. And the thing is that's all structured content. So that means that you have to have this structured, content that you deliver, and then people can use that to then train themselves up, or you can create certification programs, etc. But it's the unstructured content, and what we've talked about most on during this webcast is how do you capture the spirit? How do you capture the essence, these stories? And so now you're starting to see this whole birth of these social learning technologies that actually take social media, internal social media like Yammer, or external social media, etc., and then they can bring that content into a place, and it kind of becomes like a knowledge management area. Mm-hmm. But the thing is those are all databases, in both cases, either the social side that's trying to capture some of the unstructured stuff, or the LMSs. That's all data and databases, which is assumptive to think that we would then go and search those databases for our answers. And I think what we've come to is that in success and in failure, there's a commonality of learning. If you're successful at whatever, either as an individual or as a group, if there's a success, the first learn is what went well. What did we do well there? And so there's learning that happens. And when there's failure, there's the same, hey, okay, what didn't go our way? What didn't go so well? And then there's learning. Now, with failure, it's consuming that learning and then having a short-term memory. They say that defensive backs in football have very short memories because no matter what, you're going to get burned for a touchdown. That's going to happen. It's going to be how can you respond to that? How can you get it out of your memory? And how can you respond to that? Whereas with success, it's goal setting. I've consumed the learn, fantastic. My next goal is this, and then you kind of go towards that. Inside companies, it's how do we, successes are easy. It's cotton candy. To celebrate success inside of an organization is the easy path. The harder path, and this is something, Jeff, I learned down at the Apollo experience, a couple of years ago, is that setting up your culture in such a way where you celebrate failure just as much as you celebrate success sets up the organization for ultimate success, because you're not burying the failure. You're not hiding the failure, meaning you're not hiding the learning that happens from said failures. And I think that's what we really, whether or not you do that offline and you do it in conference rooms or on conference calls, etc., or you do it in some type of structured way and you get it into a database. The goal is that you put just as much of an emphasis on celebrating failure, meaning, you know what, we could use this moment to just kind of beat you down or not talk about it or hide from it, or we're just going to bring it up on your performance review, etc. But you know what, truth is, it was a fail. Let's all recognize it as a fail. Let's learn from it. And then let's see how we can not do that particular fail again. Like, let's celebrate those failures. So I think that HR is struggling with the successes are really easy to celebrate. Failures, not as easy, but I think that's where the gold is to be mined in all of this learning.
Thank you, William. That's very helpful. You know, we've had a lot of questions that we haven't been able to get to, so I apologize to people who've asked those questions. I'm going to ask one of the last questions of the group that comes from the audience and ask everyone to address it in 30 seconds or less. But one of the questions is time. You know, time is always the biggest challenge for everybody. So how do we make the time to reflect, look back, debrief, just to get the learning either from a mistake or from a success? So, Joe, 30 seconds or less.
Well, valuing conversation and dialogue, for one thing, and valuing feedback in the organization is absolutely essential. We're a system. Input, output, feedback. That's how systems function. And without feedback, the system doesn't work. And if you've got to assure that there's the capacity for high-quality, fast feedback if you're going to respond.
That's great. So focus on feedback, quality conversations. William, the same question over to you. Time, that's always the big challenge. How do we take the time? How do we find the time?
Well, you know, here's the deal. You prioritize what's important. And IBM, I believe it's IBM. I don't want to attribute it to them if it's not theirs, but I believe it's IBM's old model of project management was any project is cut into thirds. 1/3 of it is planning the work. What are we trying to achieve? 1/3 of it was working the plan. Like, okay, now that we've planned it, now we got to go and do it. Okay. And then 1/3 of it was learning. And they institutionalized learning. Somehow we've gotten away from that, and I think, Jeff, we're all busy, but truth is you have to prioritize learning or it just doesn't happen.
So, David, question over to you again. Time, how do you make the time? We just heard a little bit about institutionalizing the learning. You know, we all have 2 or 3 jobs to do in a day. How do you make the time to capture and then debrief what you've learned, both from mistakes and successes?
So, amen to what William and Joe just said. And I guess my response to that would be to ask a question to the audience, and that is, you tell me which is faster, to stop and have the conversation about learning, or to never have that conversation and then go forward and make the same mistake again. Mm-hmm. Which one saves time?
No, David, that's an excellent point. And David, William, Joe, I want to thank all of you for your participation. This has been a very rich discussion. On behalf of the conference board, I want to thank you folks as well as the audience for your time and participation. For the people joining us on the webcast, we really want your feedback. We talked about feedback a number of times in the program, so please click on the link on the brief survey that immediately pops up following the webcast. This feedback will help us to determine what type of programming you want to offer and improve our webcasts according to your needs. We hope you enjoyed your participation in the program. If you want more information on our Team USA or Gold Medal Leadership programs, you can go to our website, or else you can email me at jj@T as in Tom, C as in Charlie, B as in Bravo.org. Again, thank you for your time and your participation, and have a good day. Thank you.